The city moved like a restless machine outside the tinted window of James Delacroix's limousine. Horns blared. People rushed past each other, eyes glued to their phones, feet pounding the concrete like they had somewhere more important to be. Inside, James sat comfortably in Italian leather, a fresh espresso in hand, skimming through the morning stock reports on his tablet. The glass between him and the city served as more than just a physical barrier. It was symbolic. It separated the man who had everything from the world that had once almost swallowed him whole. Then the car slowed. A red light. Just another pause in a perfectly scheduled day. But what happened next wasn't scheduled at all. As James casually glanced out the window, something caught his eye. Something so out of place, so jarring, that he nearly dropped his cup. There, crouched on the corner beside a trash-stained curb, was a homeless man. His coat was torn, his hands cracked from the cold. Bags of worn belongings sat beside him. But it wasn't the poverty or the stillness that made James freeze. It was the face. That face. Same cheekbones, same jawline, same tired, deep-set eyes. It was like staring into a mirror distorted by time, dirt, and pain. James leaned forward, breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the noise outside vanished. The world blurred. It was just him, and the man who shouldn't have looked like him at all. They locked eyes for barely a second, but it felt eternal, like something ancient had just awakened inside him. Then the light turned green. The limousine eased forward, taking James away from the corner, from the mirror image he wasn't ready to face. But his reflection stayed burned in the glass, and in his mind. The moment the limousine rolled forward, James snapped out of his daze. He leaned toward the front, knocking on the tinted divider with urgency. "Turn around," he told the driver, voice low but firm. "Now." The driver blinked, surprised. "Sir?" "Back to that corner, right now." Without asking questions, the driver made a sharp U-turn at the next block, the powerful engine purring through the streets of Manhattan. But when they returned to the spot where James had seen him, the man was gone. There was no sign of the crouched figure, no bags, no coat, nothing. Just the same cracked sidewalk and a bus stop sign swaying gently in the cold breeze. James scanned the crowd frantically, leaning closer to the window like it might somehow give him a better view. His heart pounded louder than the city noise, but the man, his face, was nowhere to be seen. The car idled for a moment, then James waved the driver forward, saying nothing. He leaned back in his seat, but he didn't relax. How could he? The rest of the ride passed in silence. His hands trembled slightly as he put away his tablet. The world outside had returned to normal, but something inside him had cracked open. That night, alone in his penthouse apartment, high above the city, James stood in front of the mirror in his marble-lined bathroom. He stared at his reflection, but all he could see was him. The man from the street, same brow, same curve in the nose, same tired intensity behind the eyes. It made no sense. He didn't have a twin. He was an only child. His mother had always said so. He had the baby pictures to prove it. And yet, how could he explain what he saw? James tried to sleep. He lay in bed with silk sheets, a luxury mattress, and the silence of wealth surrounding him. But his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, that face returned, covered in dirt, etched with struggle, staring back at him like a ghost demanding to be remembered. At 3:07 a.m., James sat up in the dark. The city lights flickered through the window behind him. He didn't know if what he had seen was real or a hallucination, but he knew one thing for certain. It had changed him. The next morning brought no peace. James sat at the long mahogany dining table in his penthouse, untouched coffee cooling beside him, eyes vacant. The city below moved forward as usual, oblivious to the storm unraveling inside its most celebrated entrepreneur. He needed answers, and the only person who could have given them was gone. His mother, Eleanor Delacroix, had passed away nearly 7 years ago. Cancer. Quick, brutal. He had flown her to the best hospitals, hired top specialists, even bought her a private villa to spend her last months in peace. But despite all the power and money in his hands, he couldn't stop time from taking the only person who had truly known him. He remembered her voice clearly, warm, firm, elegant. always calm, always in control. But suddenly, as he sat there in silence, he remembered something else. She had hated mirrors. She used to keep only one in the house when he was growing up. And even then, it was always covered with a shawl. As the thought chilled his spine, James stood and walked to the old cabinet in the corner of his office. Inside it were things he hadn't touched in years: family heirlooms, birthday cards, letters, in a thick, dusty photo album bound in worn leather. He pulled it out gently and laid it on the table. Page by page, he flipped through the images. His mother's youth, their small apartment, the rare photo of James at 4 years old, standing stiffly in a knitted sweater in front of a Christmas tree. And then he paused. That photo, the only known picture of his childhood. He had always assumed it was just him, but now as he looked closer, really looked, his breath caught. To the far left of the image, barely visible in the blur of background lighting, was the edge of a second figure. A small shoulder, a hand gripping the corner of the wall, a faint face, half hidden in shadow, a silhouette. James stared at it, heart pounding. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a smudge. It was someone. Someone who had been there all along. A child, about his size, standing just outside the frame of his entire life. He touched the photo with trembling fingers. "Who were you?" he whispered aloud. But deep down, he was starting to suspect the answer. James didn't sleep that night. The photo haunted him, its blurred edge like a whisper from the past, asking to be seen. By sunrise, he was pacing his office like a man possessed. Logic told him this was a coincidence, a forgotten cousin, a trick of light and memory. But instinct said otherwise, and James Delacroix had built an empire by trusting his instincts. By noon, he was sitting across from one of the city's most discreet private investigators, the kind hired by celebrities to clean up scandals before they made the tabloids. "Find out everything you can about my birth," James said, sliding a thick envelope across the table. "Hospital records, delivery room staff, any files related to my mother, Eleanor Delacroix, 36 years ago." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "Looking for a long-lost sibling?" James didn't answer, just stared, cold and direct. The message was clear. Ask no questions, deliver results. 3 days later, the phone call came. "I think you'd better come see this in person." James met the investigator in a small downtown office lined with filing cabinets and dusty coffee mugs. On the table between them sat a manila folder, slightly worn at the edges. The investigator opened it slowly. "Your birth certificate checks out. Single male birth. Normal delivery. Signed and witnessed." James nodded. "And?" The man pulled out a second sheet, yellowed, typed in fading ink. "But the hospital ledger from that same night says otherwise." He pointed. "Twin birth, 2 males, born 5 minutes apart. Baby A, James Delacroix. Baby B." James leaned in. His stomach dropped. "Marked as stillborn," the man finished quietly. A chill wrapped around James's spine like a noose. He scanned the document again. There was no name for the second child, just a scribbled initial and a note. No signs of life at birth. "Was there a death certificate?" James asked. The investigator shook his head. "No paperwork, no autopsy, no burial record. It's like he just disappeared." James sat back, breath shallow. His whole life he had believed he was alone, an only child. But now the truth clawed its way through the cracks of his identity. There had been another heartbeat beside his, another soul born into the world, then erased, or so they thought. It had been a week since James learned the truth, or at least the start of it. He hadn't told anyone. Not his assistant, not his legal team, not even the therapist he only visited twice a year out of obligation. The information sat in his chest like a lead weight. He couldn't eat, couldn't focus, and most importantly, he couldn't forget that face. So when his foundation invited him to a charity event for underprivileged families, he almost declined, but something told him to go. A pull he couldn't name, like gravity bending in a direction only he could feel. The event was being held in a renovated community gym on the Lower East Side. Balloons clung to walls. Plastic tables held trays of donated food. Volunteers buzzed around distributing supplies to children and parents alike. James arrived quietly, dressed down, no security, no press. He didn't want to be seen. He wanted to see. He stood near the back, blending into the edge of the crowd. That's when it happened. Across the room, near a juice stand and a pile of backpacks, a child tripped over a loose shoelace and hit the floor hard. The room was loud, distracted. No one noticed, except one man. A tall, weathered figure stepped forward from the shadows of the wall. He bent down and gently helped the boy up, brushing off his coat and tying his laces with quiet care. James's breath caught. It was him. Same face, same posture, same aura of quiet strength. The man didn't look around for praise or recognition. He simply gave the boy a reassuring pat on the back and walked away toward the exit. James felt the familiar tightening in his chest again, but this time it was more than shock. It was pain. The man hadn't noticed him, or if he had, he didn't react. But James couldn't take his eyes off him. Watching that moment of tenderness, the way the man instinctively helped, like it was second nature, shattered something inside him. He wasn't just looking at someone who looked like him. He was looking at someone who might have been him, if life had chosen differently. James couldn't sleep after the event. His thoughts looped endlessly. Faces, files, shadows in photographs. And now, that moment. The man kneeling to help a child with no hesitation, no pride. It wasn't just familiarity anymore. It was undeniable. The way he moved, the quiet in his eyes. It wasn't similarity. It was sameness. James needed to know who he was. The next day, he visited one of the shelters that had helped organize the charity event. He wore a hoodie, plain jeans, no entourage. His usual mask of power stayed behind in the tower above Midtown. A volunteer recognized him anyway. Everyone did. But James cut her off gently. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "He was at the event yesterday. Tall man, long coat, worn boots, helped a boy who fell." She hesitated, then nodded. "Jack." "Jack? Yeah. He comes through here sometimes. Doesn't stay long. Keeps to himself. Polite. Quiet. Real protective of the kids in the food line." James swallowed. "Do you know where he is now?" "Soup kitchen on 47th and Lenox, most likely. They serve early." The next morning, James was there before sunrise. He waited in the bitter cold, paper cup of black coffee steaming in his hands. He stood in the line with everyone else, head down, heart hammering, and then he saw him. Jack stood a few people ahead, shoulders slightly hunched from the cold, but still tall, still unmistakable. James approached slowly, quietly. When Jack turned, their eyes met again, and for a single moment, it was like time bent around them. James offered him the coffee. "It's hot," he said. Jack looked at the cup, then at James. He nodded once. "Thanks." His voice was deep, rough, but not unfriendly. They stood there in silence for a moment, sipping coffee side by side. James finally dared to say it. "You look familiar." Jack gave him a tired half smile. "You'd be surprised how many people say that." But James wasn't surprised. He was certain. He wasn't just looking at someone who reminded him of himself. He was looking at a man who was him, in another life. James had always relied on data, not feelings, not fate, just facts. It was how he built his empire. One line of code, one calculated risk at a time. But standing next to Jack, sipping coffee in the cold morning air, he felt something no data set could define. It wasn't déjà vu. It was blood. And yet he needed proof. He didn't ask questions that morning. He didn't reveal who he was. Instead, he listened. Jack spoke sparingly, mostly about the shelter rotation, the food line, a volunteer named Maria who always slipped him extra bread when no one was looking. He had a softness in his voice, even when talking about hardship. James offered to buy him breakfast. Jack politely declined and walked off before the crowd grew. But before he left, he scratched his head with one gloved hand, and a strand of hair floated to the ground, catching in the breeze. James moved like a man possessed. He plucked it up with a tissue, careful not to touch it directly, and tucked it into a sealed plastic bag he always kept in his coat for emergency prototypes. Within 2 hours, it was at a private lab. No name, no backstory, just two samples, his own and Jack's. Labeled anonymously, paid in cash. Then came the wait. 3 days later, his phone buzzed. One message, one line. Sample A and B, 99.9% genetic match. James dropped the phone. It bounced on the hardwood floor of his office as he backed away from the desk like it had caught fire. He sat down slowly, head in hands. His ears rang. The world around him faded. It wasn't a theory anymore. It wasn't a haunting resemblance. It wasn't guilt. It was truth. Jack wasn't a stranger, wasn't a look-alike. He was his brother. A brother no one had ever told him about. A life erased at birth, recorded as stillborn, left to wander the streets while James grew up in penthouses and private schools. The anger came next, not at Jack, but at the silence, at the lies, at his mother, at whoever had decided that one life deserved more than the other. James stood, fists clenched. He wasn't going to run from this, not anymore. Now that he knew the truth, he had to face it. The truth clawed at James like a slow burn beneath the skin. For days, he didn't speak to anyone. His board of directors thought he was sick. His assistant said he looked like he hadn't slept in a week. They weren't wrong. He had the test results locked in a drawer, printed on official letterhead. He had stared at them 100 times. 99.9% match. There was no denying it. Jack was his twin. And yet, the question burned deeper than the answer. Why hadn't anyone told him? Only one person could have, and she was dead. But James remembered something else, his mother's journals. She had kept dozens of them, handwritten volumes full of daily reflections, spiritual quotes, garden sketches, and at times, confessions. They were stored in a cedar box in the hallway closet, untouched since her passing. He brought it to the center of his office like it was holy, sat on the floor, began flipping through them one by one. Some were mundane, grocery lists, dream fragments, worries about James's schoolwork. But in the third journal, dated the year he was born, he found a folded piece of paper pressed between two pages. It wasn't part of the journal. It was older, creased, tear-stained. It read, "I couldn't give Jack away, but I couldn't save him either. Or so I thought. They told me he didn't survive, that there was no heartbeat. But when I asked to see him, they said he had already been taken, that it was too late. I knew something wasn't right. I knew it in my bones. But I was young, alone, and no one listened." James stared at the ink. It shook in his hands. "I never forgave myself for not screaming louder, for not demanding the truth. I raised one son while mourning another. But I always wondered if he was out there, somewhere, if he knew he was loved, if he ever looked in the mirror and saw something he didn't understand." Tears blurred the words. James folded the paper slowly and pressed it to his chest. She had known, or at least she had suspected, and she had carried that silent grief her whole life. Now James was carrying it too, but grief wasn't enough anymore. It was time for action. James didn't rehearse the conversation. There was no script, no calculated approach, no PR strategy. This wasn't a press event. It was a reckoning, a confrontation between two lives that should have grown side by side, but had instead been torn apart before they even began. He found Jack outside a shelter just before sunset. The city lights were flickering on, casting long shadows over cracked sidewalks. Jack was sitting alone on the edge of a low stone wall, sipping lukewarm soup from a paper cup. James approached quietly, holding two coffees. Jack looked up and gave a nod of recognition. "You again," he said. "What's with the charity?" "It's not charity," James replied, handing him the cup. "It's something else." Jack took the coffee and waited. James sat down beside him, both men silent for a moment as traffic hummed by in the distance. Then James exhaled. "I know who you are." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" James looked straight ahead. "Your name is Jack. You were born 36 years ago at St. Augustine Medical. 5 minutes after me." Jack froze. James continued, voice steady but strained. "They told my mother you didn't make it, but you did. Somehow, you were taken, lost, or thrown away. I don't know all the details yet, but I had your DNA tested. Jack stood up abruptly, coffee sloshing from his cup. What the hell are you talking about? I'm your brother, James said. Your twin. Jack stared at him, the muscles in his jaw tight. For a moment, he looked like a man trying to decide whether to laugh or scream. You live in a goddamn glass tower, Jack said through gritted teeth. Private jets, fancy suits, a building named after you, and now you show up here, telling me we're family? James stood slowly, keeping his distance. I didn't know. I swear. I didn't find out until last week. Jack's voice cracked. You were living in a mansion while I was dying on the streets every day. Silence. Heavy, cutting. I didn't get a crib, Jack whispered. I got a cold floor. You got birthday parties. I got cigarette burns. James felt his throat close. I'm sorry, Jack laughed bitterly. You think sorry changes 30 years of silence? No, James said quietly, but maybe truth can. Jack didn't reply. He just turned and walked away into the night. But James didn't follow, because sometimes the truth doesn't close the distance. It only shows you how far apart you really are. The city never sleeps, but sometimes it grieves. That night, two men who had shared a womb, but lived worlds apart, existed under the same stars, each in their own silence. James sat in his penthouse office on the 82nd floor, the skyline glittering behind him like a crown he no longer felt worthy of wearing. The room was sleek, spotless, every inch curated for power and prestige. But tonight, none of it mattered. He had tried to work, tried to bury himself in projections, acquisitions, anything that would distract him. But the only thing he could see on the screen was his own reflection, superimposed over spreadsheets and stock charts. And in that reflection, he saw Jack. Same eyes, same mouth, same furrow in the brow when overwhelmed. He reached for a framed photo on his desk, his 6th birthday. Cake, balloons, his mother beaming. He had always thought that photo captured joy. Now he saw absence. Meanwhile, across the city, Jack was walking a loop he knew too well, through the alleys near Lenox, past the bus terminal, toward a vent that blasted warm air where he usually slept. The sidewalk beneath him was uneven. His coat had a new tear. He passed dozens of faces, all looking past him, through him, but one convenience store window stopped him cold. Not because of what was in it, but because of what it reflected, his own face. For a long time he stared, not in vanity, in disbelief. He saw James. He saw himself. He saw everything he never got to be. And yet, the tears that welled up weren't from envy. They were from recognition. 2 roads, one paved in gold, the other cracked and cold. But somehow tonight, both ended at the same place. A mirror, a truth, and the ache of everything they'd missed. In 2 different rooms, separated by class, distance, and decades of silence, both men lifted their hands to their own reflections. And for the first time, wept for each other. The next time they met, it wasn't planned. Jack hadn't called. James hadn't sent a car. It just happened. A week had passed since their last conversation. The night truth burned through everything. James had spent it buried in silence, unsure whether to chase or wait. He chose the latter. Then one afternoon, as he walked alone near the West End shelter, no security, no assistant, just a hoodie and his thoughts, he saw Jack, sitting on a park bench, smoking a half-burnt cigarette, staring at a tree that had lost most of its leaves. Their eyes met. This time Jack didn't walk away. James sat beside him without a word. For a long while neither spoke, just the wind between them, rustling dry branches. Then Jack broke the silence. You ever been in a place where no one calls you by your name? James turned his head. Jack kept staring straight ahead. First orphanage, they just called me boy. Second one, I was 34. That was my bed number. James said nothing. He knew now that anything spoken too soon would feel like pity. Jack went on. You learn early not to cry too loud. It makes you a target. So you learn to hide your feelings, to disappear in plain sight. He tapped the bench lightly. Funny, huh? You get good at becoming invisible. James took a breath. I wasn't in an orphanage, but I get what you're saying. Jack raised an eyebrow. Do you? James nodded slowly. I spent my whole life being praised, admired, photographed, and yet I never felt known. I was the miracle boy, the genius, the Delacroix heir. But no one ever asked me who I was, just who they expected me to be. Jack looked at him for a moment, really looked. For the first time, there was no tension between them, just recognition. You know what's worse than being abandoned? Jack asked quietly. Being remembered wrong. James didn't have an answer, but in that moment, he didn't need one. Because for the first time, they weren't fighting for space, they were sharing it. And though their childhoods were lived on opposite ends of existence, both had been missing the same thing, a brother. In the days that followed, James tried to do what he knew best, fix things. For him, problems had always been solvable. Throw money at them, build a team, write a check, upgrade the system. So he did what any powerful man would when confronted with injustice. He made an offer. They met again, this time in a quiet cafe far from the business district. Jack looked out of place in his worn jacket and weathered boots, but he walked in with his head high, shoulders squared. James had reserved a private booth. On the table sat a small folder, clean, crisp, prepared. I got you a place, James said. 1 bedroom, warm, furnished, it's yours. No rent, no questions. Jack raised an eyebrow. I also talked to someone I trust. There's a job open at one of the community centers I fund. It's nothing flashy, just coordination work, but it's yours if you want it. He slid the folder forward. Inside were apartment keys, a new ID, and a prepaid debit card. Jack looked down, then back up, and slowly pushed the folder back. I'm not a charity case, he said. His tone wasn't angry, it was steady, controlled. I never said you were. Jack leaned forward. You're trying to fix something that can't be fixed with handouts. James frowned. I'm trying to make things right. No, Jack said. You're trying to erase your guilt. That's different. Silence hung between them. Jack exhaled. You want to help? Then don't give me comfort. Give me opportunity, not a cushion, a platform. Don't hand me a solution. Ask me to build one with you. James was quiet, humbled. Jack continued. You've lived your life being heard. I've lived mine being ignored. If you want to do this right, then meet me in the middle. Don't give me help. Offer me equality. James nodded slowly. It wasn't the response he had expected, but it was exactly the one he needed. Because real change wasn't measured by generosity, it was measured by shared ground. For the first time in his life, James Delacroix found himself unsure of his words. Not because he lacked ideas, but because he wanted to get this one right. This wasn't a business deal, a keynote pitch, or a branding campaign. This was personal, and if he mishandled it, he risked losing the only person who had ever truly mirrored his existence, literally. So he invited Jack, not to an office, but to a quiet, creative loft space on the edge of the city. The place was filled with sketches, whiteboards, stacked books, and sunlight cutting through tall windows. It was where James had built his first prototype, where his first company was just an idea scribbled on a napkin. Now it would be where something even more important would begin. Jack entered cautiously. He wasn't impressed by architecture, but he noticed how quiet the space was, how free it felt from expectations. James pointed to the largest whiteboard in the room. On it was a title in bold black letters, Reflect. Underneath were bullet points, photos, ideas. James turned to Jack. I want to build something with you. Not for you, with you. Jack raised a brow. What exactly? A platform, James said, that breaks the myth that success is just about talent or hard work. That tells the truth. About class, circumstance, race, survival. We show that two people can be born the same and be treated completely different based on what zip code they go home to. He continued, his voice picking up momentum. We create public conversations, education programs, a speaker series, tech labs in underfunded schools. We document our story, how you survived, how I was protected, how both of us were lied to. Jack was quiet. He stepped closer to the board, saw pictures of broken classrooms, prison stats, foster care numbers. But then he saw a space labeled Jack's voice. It wasn't written in smaller font. It wasn't in the corner. It was in the center. James followed his gaze. This isn't a PR move. I'm not here to elevate you. I'm here to level with you. Jack walked around slowly. The silence felt heavier than noise. Then he picked up a marker and scribbled beneath the title, Not Charity. Clarity, not pity. Power. He looked back at James. You want to build something real? James nodded. More than anything. Jack's expression shifted, less guarded, more curious. Then let's stop telling stories about success and start telling stories about truth. And in that moment, a new project was born, not in code, not in capital, but in reconciliation. The word transformation sounded artificial to Jack at first, like something you'd find in a self-help book or a corporate retreat. But over time, as the days bled into weeks and the silence inside him started to shift, he realized something deeper. He wasn't transforming. He was returning to a self he never got the chance to become. It started small. Therapy was the first step, reluctantly at James's suggestion. Jack had scoffed at the idea at first. You think a few sessions are going to undo decades on the street? He had said. But James hadn't argued. He'd simply said, You've carried all of this alone. Maybe it's time you didn't have to. That first appointment was uncomfortable. Jack sat in the corner of a warm office, arms crossed, staring at the diploma on the wall instead of the therapist across from him. He didn't talk much, but he came back. By the fourth visit, he was talking about his childhood. By the sixth, he was crying. His past was raw. Group homes, cold winters, nights with hunger gnawing through his ribs. But therapy didn't erase it. It gave it language. Next came the classes. James had arranged access to courses, public speaking, leadership, digital literacy. Jack didn't want handouts, so he insisted on signing up under a different name. He took the bus to community colleges and listened with the focus of a man who'd spent a lifetime being ignored. He practiced speaking in front of mirrors, working to smooth the rough edges of his voice, not to impress others, but to command his own story. He studied how politicians held space, how poets held silence, and slowly he started holding his own. He read books he'd never had access to, began journaling. His words turned from survival to vision. James watched quietly, never interfering, never praising too loudly. He knew Jack didn't need applause. He needed autonomy. Jack didn't try to erase the past. He didn't trade his coat for a suit or his truth for acceptance. Instead, he carried it forward, as fuel, as foundation, as fire. He wasn't becoming someone new. He was becoming who he had always been meant to be. They had promised each other silence. For now, no press conferences, no tell-all interviews. Reflect was still in its early stages, fragile and real, and neither Jack nor James wanted it to be cheapened by headlines or turned into another media circus. But the world has a way of discovering what it isn't supposed to know. It started with a blurry photo. Someone had snapped it outside a community center where Jack had just finished giving a small talk on urban inequality. He and James had exited side by side, identical in frame, posture, and face, but dressed in two very different lives. Within hours, the image hit social media. Tech billionaire James Delacroix seen with mystery man, his secret twin? Speculation exploded. Theories ranged from conspiracy to scandal. Was it a lost brother? A body double? A publicity stunt? A clone? The truth, when it finally surfaced, was more human than anyone expected. A reporter dug deep. Old hospital records surfaced. Then came a whistleblower, an ex-nurse who remembered a second baby from that night, never recorded properly. And suddenly the headline was real. Lost twin found on the streets. The story went viral in under 48 hours. Every major outlet ran it. Morning shows begged for interviews. Late-night hosts made tasteless jokes. And the public? They were torn between awe and outrage. James, known for controlling narratives with surgical precision, went silent. Cameras waited outside his offices, but he slipped in and out through back entrances. He wasn't ashamed, but he was overwhelmed. This wasn't a product launch. This was his soul on display. Jack, on the other hand, stood tall. He didn't run, didn't shrink. He answered questions calmly, appeared on one live interview, and spoke with quiet conviction. I wasn't lost, he told the camera. I was just never looked for. He didn't speak like someone asking for sympathy. He spoke like a man reclaiming space. Reporters tried to frame it as a fairy tale, a rags to riches saga, but Jack corrected them every time. This isn't about wealth, he said. It's about worth. James watched the broadcast from his office, hands folded, pride in his chest and tears in his eyes. He had built many things in his life, companies, buildings, legacies. But this was the first time he had helped build a voice. The media storm had barely settled when another wave came crashing. This time, not from the public, but from the past. A truth long buried, hidden beneath hospital papers, whispers, and one woman's grief finally clawed its way to the surface. It started with a single envelope. James received it late one evening. No return address, just his name written in old-fashioned handwriting he immediately recognized. His mother's. Inside was a worn letter, dated nearly 4 decades ago. Attached to it was a second envelope, sealed, labeled, for James and Jack. When the time is right. James sat in his study, heart pounding. The fire crackled beside him, but he felt cold. Slowly he unfolded the letter. My sons, if you're reading this, then the truth I never had the courage to say out loud has finally found its way to you. Jack, you were never stillborn. That was a lie I was forced to live with, a lie I've buried in my body every single day since. Your father didn't want you. When I told him I was carrying twins, his face changed. He said we could only raise one child, that there wasn't room for finances, for noise, for you. He decided before you were born that you would not be part of our future. I begged, I screamed, but he was powerful, and I was scared. He arranged everything, a private agreement, a quiet nurse. No records, no birth certificate for you. You were taken away before I could even hold you. They told me you didn't survive. I wanted to believe it, because believing you were gone was easier than believing someone had stolen you. But deep down, I always knew. James's hands shook. Tears streamed freely now, staining the edges of the paper. He handed the second sealed envelope to Jack later that week. They sat on a bench outside the Reflect community office. Jack opened it slowly. Inside were hospital bracelet tags, 2 of them. One labeled Baby A, one labeled Baby B. Jack stared at the faded ink. His breath caught. James whispered, She tried, Jack. She tried to fight for you. Jack didn't say anything for a long time. He looked out over the city, fists tight, eyes glossy. I always thought I was unwanted by the world, he murmured. Turns out I was unwanted by my own father. James leaned in gently. But not by me. That day the air between them shifted again. The wound was deeper now, but so was the bond. Because some truths destroy illusions. But they also clear the ground where something honest can finally grow. The letter from their mother had left a silence between them, but not the kind that pushed people apart. It was the kind that made room for things that couldn't be rushed. Grief, understanding, forgiveness. They continued working together. Reflect was growing faster than either of them anticipated. Schools were calling. Conferences were requesting appearances. Donors were offering support. And in the middle of it all, 2 brothers, one raised in marble, the other on pavement, were building something neither could have done alone. But James couldn't shake a thought. He had inherited everything. The wealth, the name, the connections, the protection. Not because he was smarter, not because he deserved it more, but because of a decision made before he'd ever opened his eyes. One night he invited Jack to his penthouse. No assistants, no chefs, just a bottle of wine and a folder on the table. Jack eyed it cautiously. What's this? James took a breath. My will. Jack froze. I updated it this week, James said. Half of everything. Company shares, properties, investments. It's all there. Legally binding, no strings. Jack stared at him for a long time, then gave a slow, sad smile. You think that's what I want? He asked. James hesitated. It's what's fair. Jack shook his head. What's fair is something you can't write into a will. He pushed the folder back across the table. I don't want to share, James, he said, voice firm but calm. I want my name cleared. I want the world to know I existed, that I was never a mistake, never disposable. James nodded, a lump rising in his throat. Jack went on, softer now. Your money can't rewrite history, but our voices, maybe they can. I don't want to own what you built. I want to build something of my own. With you, not from you. It was the most powerful thing James had ever heard. Because true inheritance isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in dignity. The auditorium was packed long before the event began. Rows upon rows of students, professors, journalists, and curious strangers filled the Grand Hall of Hamilton University, one of the nation's most prestigious schools. The buzz wasn't just about a guest lecture. It was about a story, one the world still hadn't quite processed. On stage stood two chairs, two microphones, a single screen that displayed the words, two lives, one DNA, two realities. When Jack and James stepped into the light, the room fell into an almost sacred silence. They looked like brothers now, not just in features, but in presence. Jack wore a dark blazer, jeans, and a calm that came not from polish, but from truth. James, crisp as always, looked less like a CEO and more like someone ready to listen. James spoke first. He talked about numbers, how he built his empire, what it cost, what it gave. But then his voice softened. I used to think success was about who worked the hardest, he said. But now I know it's also about who got to start on the map. He turned to Jack. And some of us weren't even given a name. Jack took a moment before speaking. He scanned the crowd slowly. When I was a kid, I used to stare at rich people on the subway and wonder what I did wrong. Turns out I was just born 5 minutes too late and into the wrong silence. Gasps, then stillness. He told them about the orphanages, the nights without food, the years he thought he was invisible. But I wasn't invisible, he said. I was unclaimed. A girl in the front row wiped her cheek. A professor covered his mouth. Jack gestured toward James. He's not here to rescue me, and I'm not here to accuse him. We're here because we both live with a piece missing. Now we're trying to make something whole. Not just for us, but for the next kid who's told he doesn't matter. Applause didn't come all at once. It came in waves. First a few hands, then more. Then the entire hall stood to its feet. Not because of pity, not even because of inspiration, but because truth, when spoken raw and without shame, demands to be honored. And in that room, two lives, once divided, now stood together. Not as a miracle, but as a message. Forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a long, uneven road. And for both Jack and James, that road had been paved with silence, betrayal, and pain neither of them had chosen, but both of them had inherited. After the conference, the media attention swelled again. Offers rolled in, book deals, documentaries, a major studio circling for film rights. But the brothers stepped back. They didn't want a spectacle. They wanted closure. For Jack, it began with a quiet walk. No cameras, no entourage. Just him and a paper envelope in his coat pocket. He returned to the place that shaped him, the rundown orphanage on the outskirts of the city, where he'd spent years being a number instead of a name. The building had aged, paint peeled from the windows. The playground was rusted, but the ghosts were still there, watching him, waiting. He met with the director, a tired but kind woman who had inherited a broken system and tried her best. I'm not here for apologies, Jack said. I'm here for change. He handed her the envelope. Inside was a personal check and a handwritten letter. The funds would repair the facility, rebuild the library, and install heating in every room. But the letter? That was for the next kid who felt forgotten. It read simply, "You matter. Even when they don't see you, you're real." Meanwhile, James faced a different kind of ghost. He stood alone before a marble headstone in a manicured cemetery, his father's grave. The man who had given him his name, his first investment, and now his deepest wound. James didn't bring flowers, just words. He knelt, brushed the dust from the inscription, and whispered, "You erased a life to preserve an image." But that life found its way back. We found each other. A pause, a tear. We fixed what you broke. Then he stood, turned away, and didn't look back. Because the past doesn't need to be rewritten. It just needs to be answered. It was early morning, the kind of morning New York rarely shows, before the horns, before the buzz, before the world starts demanding who you are and what you're worth. The Brooklyn Bridge stretched before them like a silent witness. The wind was sharp but peaceful, the sun rising just enough to paint the sky with soft gold. And on that bridge, side by side, walked two men. No cameras, no bodyguards, no crowd. Just Jack and James. They weren't speaking, but they didn't need to. Every step they took was a sentence. Every breath, a page turned. The city skyline watched from a distance, as if holding its breath. Jack wore a simple jacket. His boots were clean but worn, the same pair he had walked the streets in, now carrying him somewhere far different. He no longer walked with his head down. James wore no tie, just a wool coat and soft eyes. The tension that once lived in his shoulders had vanished. He no longer looked like a man trying to prove he belonged at the top. Because up here, on this bridge, there was no top. There was just ground, and two brothers walking on it, together. They paused midway. The river below shimmered, carrying decades of stories in its current. Jack leaned on the railing, squinting toward Manhattan. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" he asked. James nodded. "All the time." Jack smiled, faint but real. "You used to live above the clouds. I used to live under the pavement." "And now?" James asked. Jack looked over. "Now we walk the middle." A long silence, but it was warm, peaceful. They didn't talk about money or blood or legacy. That had all been spoken, all been settled. What remained was presence. Two brothers bound not just by DNA, but by choice. They weren't the CEO and the survivor anymore. Not today. They were simply two men who had been broken, lost, found, and finally, whole. They stepped forward in sync, heading toward the other side. The bridge behind them didn't disappear. It remained like their story. Solid, honest, walked fully. And ahead of them, a future, shared, not inherited.